There are secrets that cling to the shadows, desperate to be told. We dragged them into the light. Welcome to Gravevale Echoes. Some family portraits don't just capture a likeness. They capture a soul. Tonight, we return to the shadowed halls of Blackwood Manor, where a lonely heiress discovers that the ghost haunting her home is tragically close to her heart. Blackwood Manor had always been a house of shadows, but now it was a house of ghosts. Not the clanking, ethereal spirits of folklore, but the heavier, more oppressive ghosts of memory, murder, and deceit. The knowledge Beatrix Dane now possessed, the terrible truth gleaned from the stranger's letter, had not brought her freedom. It had simply changed the nature of her prison. Before, she had been a lonely girl in a gloomy house. Now, she was the daughter of a murdered woman, walking the halls of the very crime scene, sharing air with the specter of a monstrous, unspoken secret. The house seemed to know of her discovery. The atmosphere within its stone walls, always thick with a latent misery, had curdled into something more active, more malevolent. The very silence seemed to have a weight and a texture, a listening quality that made the hairs on the back of Beatrix's neck perpetually stand on end. On this particular evening, the house's oppressive nature was amplified by the world outside. As dusk settled, a thick, chilling fog had rolled in from the desolate, wind-swept moors that surrounded the estate. It was not a gentle, drifting mist. This was a true moorland fog, a dense, wet, and blinding entity that moved with a slow, deliberate purpose. It swallowed the landscape whole, erasing the horizon, the skeletal trees, and the winding road that led to the distant, sleeping villages. It crept up to the walls of Blackwood Manor and wrapped its cold, gray arms around it, isolating it completely, transforming it from a house on the moors into a stone ship adrift on a silent, featureless sea. The fog pressed against the window panes, its ghostly, white face peering in, muffling all sound from the outside world until the only sounds left were those born within the manor's own dark heart. To be inside Blackwood Manor now was to be inside a tomb. The house had always suffered from a profound and genteel neglect, a testament to her father's all-consuming grief, or, as she now suspected, his all-consuming guilt. But what had once seemed merely sad now seemed sinister. She wandered the halls, a lone, black-clad figure in the decaying grandeur, and saw everything through new, horrified eyes. The dust, which lay thick on every surface, was no longer just a sign of a house unkept. It was the dust of ages, the fine, gray powder of secrets left to rot. In the faint shafts of moonlight that managed to penetrate the grime-covered windows of the great hall, the dust motes danced and swirled like tiny, frantic ghosts, a constant, silent blizzard of the past. The air was stale, motionless, and thick with the layered sense of a house dying a slow death. There was the smell of damp stone, of mildew creeping into the priceless tapestries, of wood rot in the ancient floorboards, and beneath it all the faint, cloying sweetness of decay. The grand furniture, still draped in its white dust cloths, no longer looked like sleeping giants. Now, they were a silent, shrouded audience, their forms witness to the terrible play that had unfolded here, their silence a testament to a conspiracy of complicity. Before, Beatrix's life had been one of quiet, ordered loneliness. Now, that loneliness had been replaced by a sharp, corrosive fear. She was no longer just alone in the house. She was trapped in it, trapped with the memory of a crime and, she feared, with the very people who had committed it. The house had shrunk, its long corridors now feeling like the narrow, confining pathways of a maze designed to keep her in. Every shadow that pooled in a corner or stretched from a piece of furniture seemed to be a hiding place. Every creak of the floorboards in the empty rooms above her was no longer a random sound of an old house settling. It was a footstep, a deliberate, stealthy footstep of someone who was watching her, waiting. Her father was dead. The stranger from New Orleans was long gone. The few remaining servants were old and silent, ghosts in their own right who haunted the kitchens and their own distant quarters. But she was not alone. The letter had revealed the how of her mother's death, but not the who or the why. The conspirators, the powerful men the doctor had written of, who were they? Were they distant relatives? Family friends? Business partners of her father? Were their portraits hanging on these very walls, their painted eyes following her with a cold, knowing stare? The not knowing was a special kind of torture. It turned every memory, every familiar face from her past, into a potential suspect. The house had become a gallery of potential murderers, and she was its curator and its prisoner. And the crying the sound had changed, too. For her entire life, she had heard it. A faint, disembodied sobbing that would come and go. A sound she had tried to rationalize as the wind, as the house's old pipes, as a figment of a lonely child's imagination. But now she knew what it was. It was the sound of her mother's grief. And it was no longer faint. It was as if her own discovery, her own knowledge of the truth, had somehow amplified it, giving it strength. It was more persistent now, more distinct. It followed her through the house, a constant, heartbreaking companion. It was not a loud, wailing grief. It was a soft, suppressed, and utterly broken sound. The sound of a woman weeping quietly into her hands in a locked room, convinced no one could hear her. But Beatrix could hear it. She would be in the library, and she would hear it seeming to emanate from behind the shelves of unread books. She would be in the drawing room, and it would seem to be coming from the cold, empty hearth. It was everywhere and nowhere. It was the sorrow of the house itself, a psychic wound that had never healed. Tonight, with the fog pressing in and the silence of the tomb-like house stretching around her, the crying was more present than ever. It was a thin thread of sound that wove its way through the oppressive quiet, a constant sorrowful reminder of the crime that had been committed, of the life that had been stolen within these very walls. It was the soundtrack to her new, haunted reality. And as she stood there in the immense, shadowed hall, a lone figure in a sea of dust and decay, she felt a subtle shift. The crying, for the first time, did not seem to be all around her. It seemed to be coming from a specific direction. It was a faint pull, a gentle, sorrowful tug, leading her away from the main part of the house, towards the long, dark gallery where the portraits of her dead ancestors hung in a silent, grim procession. The house, and the ghost of her mother's sorrow, had something it wanted to show her. The crying was a lodestone, pulling Beatrix through the suffocating stillness of her home. For the first time, the disembodied sound had a sense of direction, a focal point. It was no longer a general, ambient sorrow that saturated the entire manor. It was a specific, localized grief, a call from a single, wounded point in the heart of the house. Driven by a new and desperate kind of courage, the courage of a person who has already discovered the worst and now has nothing left to lose, she began to follow it. Her path led her away from the grand, cavernous spaces of the main hall and toward the west wing. This part of the house was older, less used, and infinitely more foreboding. It was here that the portrait gallery was located, a long, narrow hall that her father had kept perpetually dark and locked for as long as she could remember. He had called it a matter of preservation, to protect the old canvases from the damaging effects of the light. Now Beatrix understood the truth. He had locked it because it was a room full of ghosts, and he could not bear to face them. As she approached the gallery, the sound of the weeping grew stronger, more distinct. The faint, almost imperceptible thread of sound became a clear, undeniable chorus of one. It was the sound of a woman's quiet, heartbroken sobs, a sound so filled with a deep, personal agony that it made an aching sympathy bloom in Beatrix's chest, a feeling that momentarily overshadowed her fear. This was not just a psychic echo, felt too real, too present. She stood before the tall, imposing doors of the gallery. They were made of a dark, almost black oak, and the air around them was noticeably colder. With a trembling hand, she turned the heavy, ornate brass handle. It was unlocked. Perhaps the servants had opened it after her father's death, or perhaps, she thought with a shiver, it had opened on its own, waiting for her. She pushed the door open, its ancient hinges letting out a low, protracted groan that sounded like a moan of protest in the dead silence. The air that flowed out from the gallery was stale and frigid, carrying the dry, papery scent of old canvas, linseed oil, and a century of undisturbed dust. She took a single candlestick from a nearby hall table and stepped inside, pulling the heavy door closed behind her. The sound of its latch clicking into place was like a jail cell door slamming shut. The gallery was a long, deep tunnel of darkness. Its walls were lined on both sides with the collected faces of her lineage, a silent, grim procession of the dead. High above, a single tall arched window was meant to illuminate the space, but its glass was so thick with grime and cobwebs that it allowed only the faintest, most spectral moonlight to filter through. This weak, silver light did not illuminate the room. It only served to make the shadows deeper and more absolute. Her candlelight was a small, brave beacon in the oppressive gloom, its flame casting a flickering, golden glow that seemed to be swallowed by the darkness just a few feet away from her. As she began to walk down the length of the hall, the portraits of her ancestors emerged one by one from the gloom, their faces briefly illuminated by her passing flame. They were a severe and joyless lot, these Danes of old. Stern-faced men with cold, unforgiving eyes stared out from their canvases, their lips set in thin, hard lines. Their wives stood beside them in other portraits, women clad in dark, restrictive dresses, their expressions ranging from pious resignation to a quiet, simmering resentment. There was no laughter in these faces, no warmth. They were the faces of people who had guarded their secrets jealously, who had valued their family name and their fortune above all else. They were the faces of people, Beatrix thought with a cold knot of dread in her stomach, who would be capable of anything to protect that name. As she moved, the shifting candlelight created a horrifying illusion. The oil paint on the old canvases gleamed and shimmered, and the shadows on the painted faces seemed to move and writhe. It was as if their expressions were changing as she passed, their cold, judgmental stares following her, their silent lips seeming to curl into faint, knowing sneers. They were not just paintings. They were witnesses, guardians, and they were all watching her, this lone, living descendant who was daring to uncover the secrets they had taken to their graves. The gallery felt like a courtroom, and she was walking past a jury that had already declared her guilty. The sound of the crying was very clear now, very close. It was a constant, sorrowful presence in the silent hall. And as she reached the halfway point of the gallery, a horrifying realization began to dawn on her. The sound was not coming from ahead of her, or behind her. It seemed to be coming from her left, from her right, from the walls themselves. It was as if every portrait in this hall was contributing a small part of its own misery to the sound, their collective, centuries-old unhappiness focused into the single weeping voice. She pressed on, her heart a frantic, trapped bird in her chest. Her destination was the very end of the hall. There, set apart from the others, hanging in the place of greatest honor on the far wall, was the one portrait her father had never covered, the one he had sometimes stood before for hours in silent, grim contemplation. It was the portrait of her mother. As she drew closer, the details of the painting emerged from the darkness. It had been painted when her mother, Eleanor Dane, was young, not long after she had married into the family. She was beautiful, her skin rendered with a luminous, lifelike quality, her dark hair piled high in the fashion of the day. She was standing in a garden, a single, perfect white rose in her hand. The artist had been a master. It was a work of breathtaking realism. But Beatrix, who had studied this painting for hours as a child, searching for a connection to the mother she had never known, saw what others did not. She saw the lie. The smile on her mother's lips did not reach her eyes. It was a polite, painted-on smile, a mask for the public. The real story was in her eyes. They were large and dark and filled with a profound, hidden sadness, a deep, weary melancholy that seemed utterly at odds with her youth and beauty. It was the look of a person who had already realized they had made a terrible mistake, the look of a bright, vibrant soul that was already beginning to be extinguished by the cold, oppressive gloom of the Dane family and Blackwood Manor. Beatrix stopped directly before the painting, raising her candle. The golden light flickered across the canvas, making the oils gleam, and it was here, standing at the feet of her mother's painted ghost, that she knew with a blood-chilling, absolute certainty. The sound was not coming from the hall. It was not an echo. It was not a trick of acoustics. The soft, heartbreaking sound of a woman weeping in utter despair was coming directly from the portrait itself. It was as if the canvas were a speaker, the paint and oil a medium for a sound that was being generated from within. She could almost feel the faint vibration of it, a sorrow so powerful it had taken on a physical, audible property. The ghost of her mother's grief had been trapped here, in this beautiful, tragic effigy, doomed to weep for eternity over the life that had been stolen from her. The portrait was not just a memory of her mother. It was a prison for her sorrow, and it had been crying in this dark, lonely hall for 20 years, just waiting for someone to finally come and listen. The world narrowed to the space of a single, ornate picture frame. The rest of the gallery, with its long, dark shadows and its silent, judgmental ancestors, ceased to exist. All the ambient, disembodied sounds of the house, the creaking of the floorboards, the distant sigh of the wind faded into nothingness. The only sound in the universe was the soft, heartbreaking weeping that emanated directly from the canvas before her. Beatrix stood frozen, her mind refusing to accept what her senses were screaming at her. It was impossible. A trick of the mind, a hallucination brought on by grief and fear. That had to be the explanation. She was overwrought, her imagination inflamed by the terrible knowledge she now carried. She was projecting her own sorrow onto this inanimate object, creating a ghost where there was only oil and canvas. She had to be determined to debunk her own senses, to force reality back into its proper, rational shape. She took a hesitant step closer. She raised the candlestick higher, its single, flickering flame casting a warm, golden light onto the portrait, chasing away the cold, spectral moonlight. She needed to see it clearly, to study it, to find the logical flaw in her own perception. As she drew nearer, the sound of the weeping became more intimate, more detailed. It was no longer just a sound. It was an emotion made audible. She could hear the small, hitching breaths between the sobs, the faint, desperate gasps for air. It was a sound of such profound, hopeless misery that it bypassed her fear and struck directly at her heart. A wave of empathy so powerful it was physically painful washed over her. This was the sound of her mother, a sound she had never been allowed to hear in life, and it was a sound of pure, unadulterated suffering. She leaned in, her face now only inches from the surface of the painting. She stared intently, desperately, at her mother's painted face, her eyes scanning every minute detail, every delicate brushstroke. The artist had been a master of his craft. He had captured the luminous quality of skin, the soft texture of hair, the subtle, sad curve of her lips. But it was the eyes that held Beatrix captive. They were beautiful, dark, and deep, and they held the entirety of her mother's secret sorrow. They were painted to be looking slightly away, off to the side, as if gazing at some distant melancholic memory just beyond the edge of the frame. The candlelight in her trembling hand wavered, and for a split second, the light danced across the surface of the painting. In that fleeting instant, she saw it. A flicker of movement in her mother's left eye. She gasped, pulling back slightly. It was a trick of the light. It had to be. The shifting flame reflecting on the glossy, varnished surface of the old paint, creating the illusion of movement. That was the logical explanation. That was the sane explanation. She held the candle steadier, her arm rigid, determined to prove it to herself. She stared, unblinking, at the painted eyes, waiting for the illusion to repeat itself, ready to dissect and dismiss it. But the next thing that happened was no illusion. As she watched, her breath held tight in her chest. A single, glistening point of light appeared in the corner of her mother's painted eye. It was not a reflection. It had a liquid quality, a three-dimensional depth that defied the flat surface of the canvas. It caught the moonlight from the high window and shimmered with a perfect, crystalline clarity. It was a tear. Perfect, impossible, painted tear. Beatrix's mind reeled. She felt a wave of vertigo, as if the floor had dropped away beneath her. This was not possible. Paint did not weep. Canvas did not grieve. And yet, the evidence was there, a single glistening drop of impossible sorrow. And then it began to move. Slowly, defying gravity, defying sanity, the tiny, luminous tear began to roll. It traced a wet, gleaming path down the perfectly rendered, painted cheek of her mother. It was a silent, heartbreaking journey. A single tear shed after 20 years of silence. It followed the curve of her cheekbone, shimmered as it passed her sad, beautiful lips, and finally came to rest at the edge of her painted chin, where it hung, a perfect, trembling diamond of grief. A choked, strangled sob escaped Beatrix's own lips. The sight was so beautiful, so tragic, and so utterly, fundamentally wrong that it felt like her mind was breaking in two. The barrier between art and reality, between the living and the dead, was dissolving before her very eyes. The sorrow trapped in the painting was so powerful it was manifesting physically, bleeding through the layers of oil and varnish into her world. She should have run. She should have screamed and fled from the gallery, from the house, and never looked back. But she was paralyzed, mesmerized by the terrible, beautiful miracle unfolding before her. She was witnessing the impossible, and she could not tear her eyes away. And that is when the true horror, the final reality-shattering event, occurred. The painted eyes of her mother, the sad, beautiful eyes that had been fixed in their melancholic, sideways gaze for 2 decades, blinked. It was not a fast, reflexive action. It was a slow, deliberate, and utterly horrifying movement. The painted eyelids, which were nothing more than a thin layer of carefully blended pigments, lowered and then raised again. The surface of the canvas, the very fabric of the painting, moved with a soft, organic motion that was the most obscene thing Beatrix had ever witnessed. And when the eyes opened again, they were different. They were no longer looking away. The pupils, the irises, the entire gaze of the portrait had shifted. They were now staring directly forward out of the painting. They were staring directly at Beatrix. The connection was like a physical blow, a jolt of ice-cold electricity that shot through her entire body. She was looking at her mother, and for the first time in her life, her mother was looking back at her. But the expression in those eyes was not one of reunion or love. It was an expression of raw, undiluted, and urgent terror. The sadness was gone, replaced by a look of stark, silent warning. The painted lips were still smiling that same, sad, polite smile, but the eyes, the living, moving, impossible eyes, were screaming a silent message at her. A message of danger. A message that said, "Get out. He is here. Run." That was what finally broke the spell. A scream, a raw, animal sound of pure, abject terror, tore itself from Beatrix's throat. She stumbled backwards, her arm flailing wildly. The candlestick flew from her grasp, arcing through the air before crashing to the stone floor. The single flame was instantly extinguished, plunging the end of the gallery into an absolute, impenetrable darkness. She did not wait to see what the living portrait would do next. She turned and fled. She ran, blindly, through the oppressive darkness of the long gallery, her only guide the faint, spectral moonlight from the distant window. She barged past the silent, watching portraits of her ancestors, their cold, painted eyes following her flight. She did not feel the pain as she cannonied into a small table, sending it crashing to the floor. Her only thought was to escape the gallery, to escape the house, to escape the impossible, living eyes of her dead, weeping mother. She reached the great oak doors, fumbled with the handle, wrenched it open, and fell out into the relative safety of the main hall, slamming the door shut on the horror within. She collapsed against it, her body racked with violent, uncontrollable sobs, her mind a shattered ruin. She had gone looking for the source of a ghost's sorrow, only to find herself face to face with a living nightmare. Beatrix lay slumped against the gallery door, the rough, cold oak a grounding, solid presence against her trembling back. The sounds of her own ragged, desperate sobs filled the vast, empty space of the main hall. She had fled, a mindless, panicked animal escaping a predator, but the image was inescapable. It was burned onto the inside of her eyelids, a perfect, vivid afterimage that was more real than the dusty, moonlit hall around her. The painted eyes, the impossible tear, the slow, deliberate blink, and the final, terrifying, direct gaze of warning. Her mind, a tempest of terror and disbelief, frantically tried to process what had happened. What was it that she had just witnessed? Was she going mad? Was that the true, tragic secret of her family not murder, but a hereditary insanity? A poison in the bloodline that had finally claimed her? Had her mother, too, seen things that weren't there, heard voices from the walls, seen paintings weep? Was the sanatorium in New Orleans real? Not a prison for a sane woman, but a final, desperate refuge for a mind that had come untethered from reality? The thought was a cold, seductive poison. It offered a kind of explanation, a twisted sort of logic. It was easier, perhaps, to believe that she was insane than to accept that the fundamental laws of the universe had just been broken before her very eyes. But as her frantic, hyperventilating breaths began to slow, another part of her mind, a deeper, more instinctive part, rejected that easy escape. It hadn't felt like a hallucination. It had felt real. The cold dread, the impossible tear, the direct, intelligent gazite had been an interaction, a communication. Her mother's spirit, her actual conscious soul, was trapped in that painting, trapped like a fly in amber, a prisoner in a beautiful, two-dimensional cage of oil and canvas. And it had used every ounce of its spectral energy, every fragment of its will, to break through the veil for a single crucial moment. Not to frighten her, but to warn her. The look in her mother's eyes had been unmistakable. The initial sorrow, the weeping, had been the passive state of her existence, a perpetual looping grief. But the final, direct gaze had been active, intelligent, and focused. It was a look of raw, urgent alarm. It was the look a mother gives her child when a stranger with ill intent approaches from behind. It was a silent, desperate scream. Danger. You are in danger. Right now. But danger from what? From whom? Beatrix pushed herself up, her legs weak and unsteady. She looked down the long, shadowed expanse of the hall. The house was silent, save for her own shuddering breaths. The fog still pressed against the windows, a silent, white siege. She was, as far as she knew, completely alone. What could her mother's ghost possibly be so terrified of? The answer, she realized with a jolt of ice-cold fear, was in the context. The warning hadn't come at a random time. It had come when she was in the gallery, surrounded by the portraits of her ancestors, the stern, cold-eyed men and their resentful, silent wives. The look in her mother's eyes had not been a general warning about the house. It had been a specific warning about that place, and perhaps, about its other silent, painted inhabitants. Her mind flashed back to the letter from the doctor in New Orleans. She was killed because she knew the truth about the final, crucial words had been smeared, lost to a blot of ink. The portrait was trying to give her the rest of the sentence. The weeping was the grief of her murder. The warning was about the motive, and the motive was somehow connected to the grim-faced people hanging on the walls. A new, horrifying thought began to form, a theory that made her previous fears seem almost quaint. Who is the ghost of Blackwood Manor? She had always assumed it was her mother, a single tragic spirit haunting the place of her sorrows. But what if she was wrong? What if her mother was not the haunter, but simply another victim, another prisoner? What if the true, dominant supernatural force in this house was not her mother's grief, but the collective, malevolent will of the Dane family itself? What if her ancestors had never left? What if their spirits, as proud, as cruel, and as secretive as they had been in life, remained bound to the house, their portraits serving as anchors, as gateways. What if they were the true jailers of Blackwood? Their spectral influence the source of the oppressive atmosphere, the decay, the profound, soul-crushing misery of the place. They had been a family that valued their name and secrets above all else. It made a terrible kind of sense that they would continue to guard those secrets, even from beyond the grave. If that were true, then her mother's spirit was not just a tragic echo. It was a renegade, a fellow prisoner who was trying to aid her escape. The warning in her eyes was not just about a general danger. It was a warning about the others. They are watching you. They know you have the letter. They know you are getting close to the truth. The gallery was not just a room of paintings. It was a den of spectral lions, and she had just walked into it. This final, terrifying realization settled into her with the cold, hard weight of truth. She was not just battling a secret. She was battling her own family, a dynasty of grim, powerful ghosts who would stop at nothing to protect their legacy, and who had already proven they were willing to commit murder to do so. Her mother's portrait was a desperate, silent ally in a war she was only just beginning to comprehend. It had wept for the past, but it had warned her of the present. It was trying to give her the message that the doctor's letter had failed to deliver. The portrait wanted to tell her what her mother had discovered. It wanted to tell her who had ordered the murder. It wanted to arm her for the fight that was to come. Beatrix stared at the closed gallery door, her terror slowly, remarkably, beginning to recede, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. She had fled, and she was still afraid. But she understood now. The ghost in the painting was the only friend she had in this house. It was her only link to the truth. And she knew, with a certainty that resonated deep in her soul, that she would have to go back. She would have to face the living painting of her dead mother again. She would have to stand before that jury of damned souls and find a way to understand the silent message her mother was so desperately trying to send. The weeping had been a lament. The warning had been a plea. The next step was up to her. The portrait wanted to speak, and Beatrix knew she had to find a way to listen. Beatrix has fled from the impossible, but she cannot flee the truth. Her mother's portrait is not just a painting. It is a prison for a grieving soul, a window into a past tragedy, and a desperate, silent guardian. What is the portrait trying to warn Beatrix about? And who or what is the real ghost haunting the halls of Blackwood Manor? Let us know your theories below. The final page is turned, but the chill will linger long after the screen goes dark. Subscribe and return for the next secret we unearth.